All right, thank you for staying with us. And before we went for the break, Renee, you had some remarks to make in regards to the issue of femicide, yes? And also, as you wind up, just give us your views on how to fix this issue of droughts and floods. What more should the government do? Your word of advice, basically, because this is a naturally occurring phenomena, but they know it's a terrible new normal.
Right, okay. First to the issue of just a response to the conversation around the table, which around femicide specifically. The increase in violence, I think we need to contextualize it a little bit. In Kenya, the statistics are that 38.5% of women between the ages of 15 to 49 have experienced physical violence once in their lifetime. That means, Trevor, what it translates to is someone has hit you. 24% of these women have experienced physical violence. That's in 2018 alone. In the last 11 months, the 8 women have been killed by men in Kenya every month. 82 cases of reported femicide in 2019. I think we need to put faces to these women, and these are the reported ones. There are those who will tell you that there are corners of Nairobi where it is normal for physical violence to be meted upon women. It is normal to expect that when you're coming out of a matatu, you will be gang raped during the day, and then they will walk away laughing, having taken photos which they will circulate. It is normal, and that should be worrying. The pushback on families and looking back at families, whereas I'm not discounting families, is that we need to understand that family units do not exist inside of a vacuum. They exist inside of a cost of living that is increasing. They exist inside of jobs that are very scarce to find. They exist inside of timelines that are taken up by simple things like traffic, which you talked about earlier on, and how long it takes. Political pronouncements that seem to denigrate women, and therefore that seem to perpetuate this culture that the bishop has alluded to, of women being secondary human beings in some way. The popularization of violence as a way of claiming masculinity. And we see it through pop culture, we see it through music, we see it once again through public pronouncements. Law enforcement and policing, which Kevin has spoken about, particularly, how do we take on allegations by children and by women that they are being abused? I disagree actually with this idea of having a chief, because a chief suggests that we can negotiate our way out of a crime, which means that a crime perpetrated on a woman is a lesser crime than other crimes. There is no negotiation for rape, for FGM. There should be absolutely no negotiation for domestic violence on the basis of ini ya nyumbani.
Even incest.
This should not, if for incest, for any crime against another human being, by virtue of her being female, does not negate it. And the ways in which this enforcement and the policing and the investigation collecting is done must be widened so that we include women into this conversation.
Okay.
The safety and security around campuses has got to be linked with safety and security in the environment. 200,000 beds versus 800,000 students does not allow for an excuse for there to be an increase in violence. It allows for there to be a reason in better policing.
Okay.
Now to the floods and to the droughts.
Yes, very briefly.
Very, very briefly. Floods and droughts, Wangari Maathai warned us about this eons ago. We cannot state that this is something that has come to a surprise to us. But I think we need to address something which I will just throw in and sort of ignite this conversation, which is that we are an extractive economy. We are not an agricultural economy. We are now at the point where we are able to produce to feed other nations, but we're not able to feed ourselves. Does that not worry you, and does that not make no sense? That we're able to grow our economy to almost 40% of our exports being agriculture-based or horticulture-based, whereas we have starvation. Number two, what is the effect of the corruption that we have and of misdirecting our resources towards things that support agriculture? We have not discussed transport as relates to the movement of food. So Kisii is flooded with food, whereas Baringo are starving. Number three, it is a constitutional right to have food and to have food security. When do we implement this, not as a progressive or aspirational right, but one for which we now hold government, both county and national, and can hold them at courts of law
Yeah.
for culpability for homicide,
Okay.
for deaths.
All right.
At the point when we do that, we will stop starving.
All right, George, very briefly. I've run
Very
out of
briefly
time.
on drought and famine and floods, rather, let me build on what Renee has said, and she made a point of Kisii is flooded with food, and Baringo is flooded with, is reeling in famine. My favorite development theorist, Amartya Sen, says that in his book, Development as Freedom, democracies do not suffer famines. So if we had a truly democratic country, the issue of food movement and all this would be sorted out. And it's also a question of broader planning. We want to see the dams to harvest this water, instead of just seeing them in paper and contracts that have not picked up. So floods everywhere, but there's no water harvesting. But also importantly, what is our role, even in our simple day-to-day behavior? You drive on the streets of Nairobi, people tossing out plastic bottles, clogging up our drainage system, which is barely existent, and eventually we expect to get a different outcome. Finally, on the issue of femicide and how to address it from a human rights perspective, I'm committing myself, not only me, but myself and my wife, that we will raise our son and daughters right from the start, so that they really get to know what it means to grow into right men, right women. And one of my 7-year-old daughters is already telling me, I think in the CBC now there's integration of human rights. She has the right to watch Nickelodeon. We'll have to moderate that. But at the end of the day, really, it's just getting it right from the start.
All right, Sheila, very briefly.
I think on the issue of floods and droughts, we need to look at the human impact or human action that contributes to environmental degradation. As Renee said, Wangari Maathai warned us years ago, and now we are living through the warnings that were given, that if we don't take care of the environment, we will suffer the consequences. So what we're seeing now is largely also as a result of the human impact, which has increased the risks of floods and drought. And then there's also the question of climate change. I think the government needs to really take firmer action in terms of addressing the causes and also mitigating the effects of climate change. But there are also simple things that we need to do. We also need to look at the question of corruption in worsening the effects of the floods and drought. When you look at, for instance, corruption in physical planning and development, like in the urban centers, we have faced a lot of floods, but it's also largely because we have allowed unchecked development. Areas which are maybe riparian land or areas which are supposed to absorb the vast amounts of runoff from the rain are now covered with concrete, are now covered with buildings, our drainage systems. I know there's been a lot of investments. I keep on seeing budgets of some of the counties, and there's investments towards building the drainage systems, but nothing seems to work. But we need to just look at some of the simple efforts that will enable us to mitigate the risks of floods. For instance, increasing the size of the drainage pipes, building the floodplains. There's also the issue of deforestation and how that has affected us, and maybe try and cut down on deforestation, and because we are trying to increase the amount of land for residential, commercial and industrial activity, but we need to also ensure that we go back and simple things like planting trees also to help us absorb greenhouse gas emissions, and that will also help us to mitigate the effects of climate change. So I think simple things, but because of lack of accountability, that these actions that county governments, the national government promised to make, but they never seem to do. And now we've just I've just seen a report that in a week the rains will reduce, and we're going to now look at the effects of droughts, but yet all this runoff, and we still have dry taps, we don't have water, so how do we actually help ourselves?
All right, Kevin, I've really run out of time.
On the initial issue, I think on late May, early June, Mheshimiwa Matiang'i was at the University of Nairobi with a host of parliamentarians, female parliamentarians. I think it's high time we went back to a number of commitments that the CS made, especially with regards to dealing with this, the issue on about femicide, and then just follow through what has both national and county governments done, because for counties it was for the county commissioners to deal with the illicit brew and those dens, because then how lucrative is that to the people who are selling those kind of drugs at the university level? So
just implement the policies.
Yeah, basically it's a call to the CS to get back to the University of Nairobi and give us a report on what you have been able to, to work on. Drought.
10 seconds.
I think my co-panelists have talked about that. I think Schedule 4 functions of county governments, really, it rests on the counties. So what value are we adding to the waters? And then tomorrow we'll start complaining about people dying.
Okay. Bishop.
Yes, I know we're running out of time. I think first about the floods, preparedness. We have the best professionals, we have the best researchers in this country, the best reports, but implementation in our nation, in a government, doesn't seem to work. And this affected largely is a consequence of corruption. We really have to address at the root accountability and the corruption issue. That's what we have. That's number one. The second is the Laudato Si of Pope Francis, which speaks about care of the environment. That is all of it, including what we know about Wangari Maathai. And then finally, as regards the femicide or those issues there, is about human dignity. Let's restore civilization. Civilization is when we give human dignity, and especially life, the paramount importance in any negotiation or anything we're doing. That's the first, irrespective of who it is, poor or rich, woman or man, equal dignity. And this is where we must bring back now the outlook, where the common good and the fitting and suitable environment, which we must address, which is the root causes of the moral issues and these symptoms that we've observed. We must call back the people to their conscience.
All right. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. Archbishop Anthony Muheria, thank you for coming in. Kevin Osido, Executive Director, County Governance Watch. Sheila Masinde, Head of Programs, Transparency International. George Morara, Vice Chair, KNCHR. And Renee Gamau, Board Chairperson, Amnesty International Kenya. Thank you for making time for that discussion. Hopefully 2020 will be a better year for all of you, and thank you for all your feedback. I have to take a quick break now. When we come back, Willis is working out. See you in just a bit.